All right, we are at the knowledge of God. Although it's a controversy with a lot of people, it's difficult because the other side of these controversies will also say, they will affirm with their mouth that God knows all things. So in other words, this is not an attribute that's controversial because the other side is flat out denying it. They are implicitly denying it, and I think in a way that is self-deceiving. If critics of Reformed theology were consistent, they would acknowledge that their objections to the Reformed doctrine of God's omniscience was at once an objection to the dominant Orthodox position that's always been held. So in a sense, I say the Reformed doctrine, but the Reformed doctrine of this attribute of God, just like the other ones, is just the classical Christian Orthodox position. Jones, in his editor's summary, I'll quote him a couple times, talked about the sticking point here. He said, if God has infallible knowledge of all things, past, present, and future, then according to the opponents of Reformed theology, humans are not free creatures. So you see right there, on the one hand, I just said this was the Orthodox doctrine. All Christendom would affirm it, officially. But then when you start to see the implications of, well, what does this mean about, for example, the creature's free will? Then all of a sudden you start making exceptions, you start watering it down, and the idea disintegrates in your hands. And Charnock's jumping off verse, he always has one, is Psalm 145:5. Great is our Lord and of great power. So far he talks about power, but then he says his understanding is infinite. So we have to understand the backdrop, the basic challenge in modern theology to this doctrine. It was made most articulate by a Jesuit priest named Louis de Molina. And so the label on this position was Molinism. And it's not the only challenge, we'll see, but in Charnock's day, that was the main challenge. Molina's dates are 1535 to 1600, so he lived in the century before Charnock is writing this, but that idea had taken steam, and you had people like the Socinians and the Remonstrants who had embraced this idea. And so the chief opponents of Reformed theology for the next century would be turning to this resource in order to make their particular arguments. Okay, so with that historical backdrop, here's where we're going, if we get this far, but the bigger sections are up front. We'll talk about the kinds of God's knowledge, the objects of God's knowledge, the mode of God's knowledge, which you might think, well, isn't that the same as that? Well, no, these are different ways or angles or perspectives on his omniscience, whereas here we're talking about the way in which he knows. And most of those are going to be negative. Not like that, that kind of thing. Then another very brief section, he'll make some connections and reasons why he must be omniscient. So he's going to make connections to other attributes of God or doctrines. And then finally, we'll talk about the uses of the doctrine if we get that far. I won't include the largest section, the one on applying it to Christ's omniscience, because I'm going to use that as a subject of my newsletter article this coming week. So let's get right to it. I do have some charts. They'll all have circles this week, but they will be dealing with different things because each of these sections is kind of dealing with a different angle. Jones gives a summary. It's well worth reading in this particular case especially. But what he does is he categorizes all these, both in the Latin, if anybody cares, which, by the way, in this case, the Latin is pretty much almost exactly the English. We get the English words we do directly from the Latin. For example, prescientia is for knowledge. Pre-scientia. Scientia is the Latin word for knowledge, and so we get the word science from that, if you're wondering. But think of that as a subsection of omni scientia. So it's very straightforward, that particular breakdown. Some of the other breakdowns may be not as familiar to us. But so based on what we've seen of eternity in one of the weeks and what we've seen about immutability in one of the weeks, we have to speak about something like this analogically. We can speak about it because the Bible uses language like foreknowledge, foreknowing, before the foundations of the earth, before the ages began. So it uses analogical language. There's nothing wrong with using the word foreknowledge and all that stuff. But I put it right here, and that's misleading. I'm using an analogy. Why? Because the word itself positions itself, or we can best understand it as something that comes before another thing. So you think about one domino in relation to another, etc. In reality, though, it's above and beyond time itself. But it's getting us to think about something in relation to before all this. So it's appropriate to speak that way. Jones points to another distinction of Charnock that's going to be even less familiar to a lot of people. Not because they're big words, but because they're kind of words that make you think, I don't even like thinking about human knowledge like that, and I certainly don't like thinking about God's knowledge like that. And here I'm talking about these words speculative and practical. In fact, one way to insult, I guess, somebody who studies theology is to suggest that all this talk about doctrine and all these fancy words and these distinctions are so nitpicky, that's speculative, or sometimes we use the word theoretical as opposed to practical. What do we mean by that? We mean you're not even a human. You're like Spock. That's what we mean by that. Put this on the bottom shelf, preacher. You're just an egghead. You're making this so impractical, or something that has nothing to do with real life. That's kind of the way we use those words. Of course, there's a truth in it, but that's not the way people use those words for 2,500 years. Now, give or take, there's different ways to say it in the Greek, Latin, English, and so forth. But by and large, that breakdown basically meant this, that speculative knowledge was to know a thing in itself for the sake of knowing that thing. So think of David in Psalm 27:4, one thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I will dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life and gaze upon his beauty. In other words, for David, the ultimate state of knowing God is something that happens with the mind. That's not exclusive of other parts of your soul, parts, or other dimensions of life. It's just saying that there is no greater end than God himself. I'm not knowing God for the sake of something greater. That would be an insult to God. So speculative actually had in mind its chief end. The mind is looking at this thing to know it, not because I can use it for something else. That would actually be degrading. You see how the shoe's on the other foot here. It's actually very human and a rightly ordered soul that has speculative knowledge. Practical knowledge was knowledge for the sake of some end. I'm using it now. So that's we do use it accurately, but unfortunately we do it to pit one against the other. Okay? And what Charnock is saying is that God has these just like we have these. I'm skipping a lot of quotes here because I was just saying that the way that I wanted to say it. But here's how Jones says it. He says, God knows himself, which has reference to his speculative and practical knowledge. Knowledge is speculative, Charnock says, when the truth of a thing is known without a respect to any working or practical operation. Therefore, God's self-knowledge is only speculative. Now, you might say, doesn't God know secondary causes and so forth? This is where it gets immediately into the deep end of the pool. But let's just hear the rest of Jones's thought. Therefore, God's self-knowledge is only speculative because there is nothing for God to work in himself. Okay? He's not saying he doesn't have practical knowledge. He's saying his self-knowledge is only speculative. Think of it. He doesn't have a greater end, and in fact, as he knows himself apart from creation, nothing else does exist. Okay? As I said, that's the deep end of the pool, but it sets us up for another distinction, which will be important when it comes to that controversy with Molinism. And that is, there is another distinction, which I think I retained in the next picture somewhere. Was that the quote? Yeah, it was. So I skipped that. Sorry. I don't, so let me just mention it here. Charnock does get into another distinction, the distinction between a knowledge of apprehension versus a knowledge of approbation. One is simply, I see the thing for what it is, now, but I also love something and then hate another thing. So I know the moral dimension of that thing. I know that this is praiseworthy, I know that this is blameworthy, and my mind, in fact, does so. I love what I ought to love, I praise what I ought to praise, I choose what I ought to choose. That is first an intellectual act before it is an act of the will or the affections. He doesn't go deeply into that, he mentions it, and so it's worth bringing up. I will bring that verse from Zechariah back in. However, this is that next distinction I was talking about. At first, it might seem like this is this really nerdy cataloging of kinds of knowledge. And what are we doing? We're immediately going back to this and saying, how is this practical? But I already gave you one answer. One reason why it's practical, helpful, useful to know this is when you run up against this. And you might think, most of us are not going to run up against this. This is deep into the pool. And by the way, the people who take this position, I think, and I say this with good grounds because I've run into quite a few of them, they take themselves to be quite intelligent exactly for this reason. They think very highly of themselves, but it is actually a quite stupid idea. And the argument against it is going to be very easy. Now, in order to do that, we need to introduce the terms. I'm putting a false idea on a picture. So I have that in dotted line. This is permeable. These are the solid lines, the other two. And that's the best I could, suppose I could have put a big red X here. I have a red X in my arsenal. I should have maybe put a red X by this. But this is the wrong view, the Molinist position, this circle. So try your best to ignore it for a second. What Charnock and all the Orthodox thinkers would hold to is that there's two, let's call them dimensions, instead of kinds of God's knowledge. And because I put this circle inside of this circle on purpose. They are distinguishable. You can abstract them, but the first mistake you can make that can tempt people with this, and it's one of the big mistakes they're making, is they think that this is separable from this. The natural knowledge of God is a way of speaking about his knowing himself and all possibilities. Modern philosophers would call those possible worlds. In other words, any particular scenario doesn't have to be an entire reality. All possible combinations of things, even in this room, would be a separate possible world. It's just a nerdy way to say that. A set of circumstances that is logically possible. In other words, there's no contradiction. So there's no square circles. Not because God is not unaware of the term square circle and that we often make that mistake, but the conception is not a thing that can be conceived. So that's not a lack of power in God, it is simply a meaningless combination of words. So that would not be included in the set all possible things. But if it's a possible thing at all, including necessary things, which are obviously possible because they're necessary, actual things, which an actual thing has to be a possible thing, otherwise it couldn't be an actual thing, and contingent things, which I'll bring up, which are not necessary, but they exist on the basis of something else or for something else. They're contingent on something which is more necessary than it. And ultimately, everything except for God is at least partially contingent. Because the only being who's necessary in himself is God. When we speak about necessary conditions, boiling water, for example, is necessary to make pasta. I don't know why I came up with that example. But that is a necessary condition, but boiling water is not a necessary thing in all possible worlds. It's not a necessary being. It's not God. God did not have to create water or heat sources. Okay? God alone is necessary in himself, but belonging to this set of things that God knows are any possible abstract thing or combination of things which exist. So hopefully you can get the idea of why actual things that God has, and why is that called free knowledge, that second category? Because those exist by God's will. He did not have to create anything outside of himself. Now, everything outside of himself, which is actualized, is at least possible, or it couldn't have been actual. That's why that circle is inside of this circle. So, and that's why it has the names natural and free. What's this? It's in the middle, so I suppose I could have diagrammed it in any other number of ways, but I wanted to do it this way to show you the first brain mistake that they are making. They are forgetting that any other circle you could possibly come up with has to first be in this circle. And that's going to create some immediate problems. Now, this middle knowledge position, as I said, was created by the Molinists, by this guy, Molina. And so everybody who wants, so why are they doing this? Because what about man's free choices? If God causes all things, but let's leave that aside for a second, if God even knows all things, then it would be a contradiction in terms for anything that comes to be, that's actualized, to be otherwise. But if that's true, then it is necessarily the case that every effect of every cause is perfectly known by God. And that would be true both about a rock that hits into another rock and about a human choice choosing one thing over another. Wait a minute, if I affirm that, then I at the same time have to deny free will. And so this guy, Molina, said, well then, I have to choose. I have to choose between man choosing or God knowing all things. But I have to affirm that God knows all things. So, maybe there is this, now in our day, there's a view called open theism. And the open theist would also say the same thing. He'd have the same struggle. I want to affirm that God knows all things. And so my solution will be, well, but the effects, however small that circle is within this circle, the effects of the choices of free human beings are not things at all for God to know or not know. So I can still affirm that God knows all things. The future, that at least that part of the future that is caused by man's free agency, is open to God. That's why they call it open theism. So those are not things, therefore I'm not actually denying God's omniscience. There's a couple problems with that. One, you are reserving for yourself that which you deny to God. You're telling us at least something about these future things. Future things, those aren't things. God can't know that. The second thing you're doing is you're constraining God to time. You're putting him on the timeline, saying he can't see over there. Because there is no there yet. Yet. See what I did with the word yet? I just constrained all minds, including God's, to time. Now, I think there's other problems with open theism, but those problems would be enough. The Molinist is a bit more sophisticated than the open theist. He doesn't want to say, well, the future, I don't want to deny, I don't want to confine God to time, although they have to do it. Like, for example, the most able proponent of Molinism today is William Lane Craig, and it's no coincidence that Craig also confines God to time, because you have to wind up going in that same place. So why is it called middle? Well, because it's sort of in between. It's obviously we're talking about something that is to be actual, and obviously it's possible. So those are decreed by God too, but given contingencies, and in this case, the contingency of man's free will. Okay, so I have to skip some more stuff in my notes because I just said it in my own words. Oh yes. This will highlight the importance of having covered the incommunicable attributes that we've already covered. Simplicity within his spirituality, immutability, eternality, and omnipresence. I feel like I'm missing one. But those ones, the importance of having covered those already, before we arrive at God's knowledge. Put things one more way, God sees all things through himself. We started to see that a couple weeks ago. And then for God to know himself completely, is to know all possibilities, because all possibilities derive themselves from God's essence. Nothing could be possible unless it was either the first cause, God, or derived from the first cause. So already you can see, hopefully, that the middle knowledge position is going to suffer the same kind of problems as the open theist position. But in addition to that, and actually, John Frame has a really good little section in his systematic theology. There's some things about his doctrine of God that I wouldn't recommend, but his section against the middle knowledge position is actually quite good and simple, and that's the only reason I'm commending it right now, because I think he does a good job making it simple and explaining, basically, well, this is really just, how is this even a third category? I mean, obviously it's possible, so it belongs in that second circle. And then obviously it's actual, it's of actual things, and they're not denying any of that. So what are you doing? What are you gaining here? And of course, I told you their motive. But it's because they're saying, well, these contingencies, and then you have to end that sentence with, have effects that are not known by God, or God does not see them yet, or they are in some way not caused by God. So you have to start pulling at that thread and denying other aspects of the doctrine of God. And Jones says, then Charnock also mentions, I already covered that. Let's fast forward a little bit. I mentioned Zechariah 3:9, just to tell you that one other verse that I had on that first slide. It talks about God as, and this is poetic language, as having 7 eyes. There's similar language in Revelation, and Charnock says that's to show his perfect knowledge of all things, of all occurrences in the world, because the number 7 is symbolic of perfection, totality. So that first section is a little heady, seems a little speculative in that wrong way, but it categorizes these because just for the grammar alone, you're going to need to be able to work with these things as he tackles this other view. Well, I guess I'll read that quote. It's sort of his summary quote of this whole first section. He says, we must then ascribe a universal knowledge to God. He's universal as an omni, total knowledge. If we deny him a speculative knowledge or knowledge of intelligence, we destroy his deity. We make him ignorant of his own power. If we deny him practical knowledge, we deny ourselves to be his creature. In other words, that he loses track of secondary causes. That's all he's going to mean by practical knowledge there. And then that's where he brings in the Zechariah 3:9 quote. So that's a universal, that's his summary statement. So let's get to this second slide here. I used the staircase for this because I don't know what else to use to diagram this sort of thing. But now I'm bringing some of these same terms that we just looked at to now examine the question, okay, what all does God know? Because that's Charnock's second section. And you see the picture here flows downward, and that's all this is meant to show, because I want to show that there's a relationship between the outer circle and then any specific thing that he knows. Remember the claim from a couple weeks ago, and Charnock's mentioned it a couple times, God sees all things through himself. Why is that important? Because if he sees things because of something about them, then the created things, are causing his knowledge. You see that? So he's learning, he's changing, he's dependent. So several attributes of God just get knocked down right away if you believe that God's knowledge of things are caused by those things, rather than God seeing those things through his ideas and intent to create them in the first place. Okay? So he's seeing those things through the knowledge of himself. It's foundational for his total knowledge of all other things, whether you're talking about possible things, actual things. And this is what Charnock calls the first and original knowledge. So outside that outermost circle, that first and original knowledge, that knowledge of himself. And then he points out how man cannot even say this much about himself, as the words of Paul call attention to in 1 Corinthians 2, 10, and 11, which, by the way, it's a great proof text for the deity of the Holy Spirit, but Charnock's going to use it here to make a point about the distinction between God's knowledge and our knowledge. Paul says, "For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. So this text is calling attention to God's self-knowledge, which, remember, is infinite. It demands an infinite knowledge since God is infinite, and all effects that are derived from what God knows in and through himself are known by himself. So right away, there's no tension between God causing all things, God knowing all things. Remember, one of the problems that I described for that middle knowledge position is that they're worried, and if God knows my future actions, then it's a contradiction in terms that would be otherwise. So it's necessarily the case. So that means his knowledge of me doing something forced me to do this thing. Well, it doesn't force you, you're doing it volitionally through secondary causes. But yes, he knows all that he desires to effect through those secondary causes. And this is what Charnock says about this self-knowledge. And he's going to say it in the negative. If it were not true, think about what would be the case. If God did not know himself in such a way, several absurdities would result. And I just do some dots here. I didn't want to quote the whole page, but here's the highlights. He would not be perfect. He could not be blessed. In other words, could not enjoy. He'd be frustrated in some way. He could create nothing. He could govern nothing. He would not know what to punish because he would not know what was contrary to himself. He could not know how he created things. Those are his actions in himself if he didn't have that self-knowledge. He could not know the beauty of his works. What is the beauty of his works? When he says 7 times in Genesis 1, it is good. It's a reflection of himself. The end of his works, in other words, his purpose in doing it. What was evil? How to punish the crimes of his offending creatures. So God necessarily knows himself more perfectly than any intellect could know anything. Since unlike all other acts of knowing which are separated from the object known, think about it, our thoughts are separate from the things we're thinking about, even when we're thinking about ourselves. It's not just that we're alienated from ourselves in sin. Even as creatures, there would be a distinction. We have to learn, we have to think, we have to catch up. God does not have to do that in his thinking. He says his understanding is his essence, namely himself. That's Charnock speaking. I think that's the hardest part about this whole subject is when you start, again, applying the simplicity of God to his thoughts, because we want to think, well, when I think of thinking, yes, I know, because we have to think about thinking. We call that discursive reasoning. There's a train. If A, then B. I'm learning something. I'm already forgetting what I just was talking about. We have those problems. God doesn't have any of those problems. He sees it all in one act. He doesn't have a faculty of mind that's separate from his faculty of will. Or he doesn't have a head versus heart problem. And these are just different ways to say it. Why is this important? Just more circles, just more grammar? He says this, God knows all other things, whether they be possible, past, present, or future, whether they be things that he can do but will never do, or whether they be things that he has done but are not now. Things that are now in being or things that are not now existing that lie in the womb of their proper and immediate causes. So what is he doing there? He's just giving you that same chart that I started with. But what he's saying now is that these other things are known through the lens of his self-knowledge. They have to be, or God would not exist and nothing could exist. It would be nonsense. Why? Because if God is the first cause and he knows those things by some other means, then those means exist. But I just said that only God exists, no other means do exist. So God has to know everything that he knows through the lens of himself, or else nothing could be. Now, Charnock divides these things that are outside of God, and this is where that picture comes in, into 5 categories. I don't number them, but all things possible, And then the three on the timeline, all things past, all things present, all things future, and then all future contingencies. One way to divide that up is by possibilities, and then everything else I just said would be an actuality. So that first chart, when I was bringing up middle knowledge, you only have these two categories, that which is possible, including that which is necessary, God himself. So I'm abstracting a little bit in this chart. And then everything that actually exists that God willed to exist. This is not to scale. There's an infinite array of possible things that God did not make actual. Okay? As far as possibilities, that first category, Charnock uses this verse right here. Romans, he uses a couple verses. Well, before I get to it, he says there's no question on this point, which is interesting because he's having a whole controversy. It's true on the surface. I don't think anybody would deny that God knows all possibilities. Even the Molinist, even the open theist would pay lip service yeah, God knows everything that's logically possible and everything that's necessary. Sure, okay, I'll go with that. But he says possibles are infinite. That is, there is no end of what God can do, and therefore no end of what God does know. Now, as far as the relation between the possible and the actual, how do they relate? He cites Romans 4:17, that God calls into existence the things that do not exist. So they have to be able to exist. They are things, but he calls them into existence. In another way of saying, Paul is using this expression that he decrees, and the word decrees can take on several meanings, but one of them is used in the more everyday speaking. Fiat, the language of a king giving a command and that thing coming to be. Well, Paul is saying that is nothing at that point, but it is at least a thing in that it can be possible. Okay, so he calls those things, and of course, God could not do that if he had no knowledge of such a possibility. This is also, and by the way, not just knowledge that it's possible, but the knowledge of which possibility he will make actual. Think about it. If you say, no, I affirm both. I affirm both that God knows all possibilities and that God knows all actualities, but you deny that he knows all actualities that all beings will cause to come into existence, well, how is he calling into existence that which he doesn't know from a set of possibilities, which ones are coming into existence, just because humans come into the picture and so on? And in order for them to be consistent, they have to do what the open theist does and says, well, there's a whole range of things then, that anywhere human freedom comes in, that whole section of the future is open to God. Okay, at least the Molinists were trying to be consistent at this point, but that's a problem. This also factors in the causality of that which does not come to be. We looked at Jonah 3 and some other passages. This will happen. Oh, you repented. I will not do that thing that I would have done to you. Here's another passage, 1 Samuel 23:11. He knew that the inhabitants of Keilah would betray David to Saul if he remained in that place. So God speaks, communicates, causes something to happen so that something else wouldn't happen. Here it's sort of a reversal of Jonah 3. Here the emphasis is on God is preventing a thing from happening that, all other things being equal, would have happened given those set of circumstances. Is God taking a risk? And this is the way open theists and middle knowledge people look at the Bible, is they think everything is talking about this. And yet at the same time, they want to talk about this being the way things are in God. They kind of want to have it both ways. Okay, here it's, again, need to know basis. God is telling you, here's the situation. If you don't do this, this will be what happens. It's for you to do a human action. It's not for you to pontificate about my action. Okay, so Charnock says he knew what they would do upon that occasion, though it was never done. Quickly through the past, present, and future, I only put one of the verses that Charnock uses because I think they're the most significant ones that he uses. About the past, he draws from Isaiah 41:22, not that one. It says, let them show the former things. There's a lot of them in Isaiah where he's challenging the false gods and challenging the people to compare the false gods to him. And chief among the attributes that distinguish the true God from the false God is that God knows comprehensively and they don't. He can tell you the beginning from the end, and they can't. He brings in a bunch of other verses, even about past sins in Job 14. I'll fast forward past all of that, but that verse was just meant to say that he tells you those former things or things from of old. As far as the present, couple verses. No creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. Hebrews 4:13. Anytime you see those verses or think of Psalm 139, the feeling you're supposed to get is that God knows you more than you know yourself. God knows your thoughts more than you. God knows your intentions more than you know your intentions. So it's kind of weird to stop at that point and say, sure, he knows all that, but he doesn't know what I'm about to do. Do you know what you're about to do? Do you have some inkling of what you're about to do? But you just admitted that God knows all of those inner things more than you know them yourselves, but you're going to deny that he knows the future of them. So he goes into a bunch of other verses about the present. He uses Genesis 1:31. God saw everything that he had made. Charnock says he did not ignorantly pronounce them so, call them good, whether he knew them or not. Okay, so he couldn't speak in all of these ways unless he knew comprehensively. And he has a whole bunch of verses that show the same thing. When it comes to God's knowledge of the future, and this is where the big controversy, and that's why I'm trying to go fast through past and present, because they'll say, well, yeah, nobody's denying that. But this is where the controversy emerges. This is simply an entailment of divine eternity and aseity. This is why we study the doctrine of God. Because if you believe everything from the first 5, 6, 7 weeks, or chapters, reading a book, you can't then turn around and deny God's knowledge of the future without denying those other attributes that you just agreed to. So, for example, Charnock says the differences of time cannot hinder a knowledge of all things by him who is before time, above time, that is not measured by hours or days or years. So Charnock is pinning a part of his argument on the impossibility of things arising in the future apart from God's will. He's counting on you, counting on the reader, to have affirmed what he had said about eternity and immutability. If you believe that, you can't take seriously what the Molinist, or in our day, the open theist, is committed to. They're committed to the notion that the creatures cause all kinds of things that are apart from divine causality. And if it comes down to it, they don't mind saying, fine, God is constrained to time. He's on the timeline. So Charnock at least cuts off any possibility of denying God's knowledge of the future simply because it is the future. So he is assuming that his reader is orthodox. I mean, obviously his argument at this point is not going to pin down someone who's willing to deny that. For one, he says, everything that is the object of God's knowledge without himself was once only future. And, he says, the whole prophetic part of Scripture declares this perfection of God. Every prophet's candle was lighted at this torch. They could not have this foreknowledge of themselves. It's a very practical point. How can you trust God? How can you take prophecy serious if God knows the future, quote unquote, but anytime human beings get anywhere near it, well, he doesn't know those things. Well, which is the Bible talking about? Mostly squirrels and rocks at the bottom of the sea? Or mostly human stuff? I'm thinking mostly human stuff. And so you say, well, no, I affirm God knows everything in the future except when human fingerprints show up. It's 99% talking about the human fingerprint stuff. See, you can't seriously maintain that position and believe in biblical prophecy, which is why when somebody goes down this road, they start disintegrating to exactly those points and lower their view of Scripture. Again, the prophet Isaiah continues this theme. This is a good one from Isaiah 46:10. Again, he's comparing himself to the idols, and on his job description of the true God is declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done. So he's saying the mark of the true God is that I know everything comprehensively from beginning to end. What do you think I've been talking about? I've been talking about the end from the beginning. So you've got an additional problem mounting on top of the problem that learning would make God's knowledge mutable. It will also be never perfected. So Charnock plays up on this, that this would deny the perfection of God's knowledge and therefore the perfection of God in general. The reason he gives is, for when you have conceived millions of years wherein angels and souls live and act, there is still more coming that you can conceive, wherein they will act. Okay, so he's just bringing out that same point. Now you say, okay, fine, on the timeline, I'll give all of that knowledge to God, but what about contingencies, as if this is some kind of radically different thing? This should work totally different. Secondary causes in the human will should look totally different than secondary causes on a pool table or something else. Well, they will look different in some ways, but not in being secondary causes. All of our causality is free and contingent. You're not a necessary being, are you? You weren't there from the beginning. Your will is not uncaused. Okay? And this is where you have to read Edwards' Freedom of the Will. But at any rate, that's another story. But to treat this as some special category. Contingencies. The one thing that seems to make a difference for people like Molinists and just garden variety Arminians that don't maybe think on this level is that, well, this thing is a product of man's freedom. This is different. So accidents are called contingencies. For instance, an arrow hitting a man intended by the archer for another person. And this is one of the examples Charnock uses. These have only a consequent necessity in them. In other words, given this gravity and this velocity and the position of that guy when he shouldn't have been in that position when I was trying to shoot that other guy, given that, yes, it is necessary that he will go in that path, but otherwise we call that an accident. Okay, but Charnock is saying, yes, but if you think about it in that whole matrix of causality, it is necessarily the case that each of these things is caused by a certain nature, and ultimately that traces back to God. Additionally, voluntary actions are called contingents because they're said to have no necessity in them. But these are all category mistakes. And as far as the first category, Charnock says, what is accidental in regard to the creature, in other words, what you're calling an accident, is not so in regard of God. And he has a biblical example now. Oh, as the arrow was the biblical example. He was just drawing it out. But he says the manner of Ahab's death was accidental in regard of the hand by which he was slain, but not in regard of God, who foretold his death and foreknew the shot and directed the arrow. You see that? So he's saying, yes, on your timeline, that arrow maybe should have gone here, but it actually plunged itself into Ahab. Guess what? From God's perspective, and by the way, that's why he told you ahead of time Ahab's going to die, because he knew every single aspect of it. He draws out the analogy of a master sending two different servants to a particular destination, a house. Unbeknownst to them, he tells them separately. Two different paths to the same direction. As far as the two servants knew, their meeting was accidental, but not to the master. And so he concludes how arrogant and absurd it is for us to allow God no greater a knowledge than we have of ourselves when we tell our two kids to go to a certain place or two servants. Contingencies are known to us when they come into act and pass from futurity to reality. And when they are present to us, we can order our affairs accordingly. So on a smaller scale, Charnock's saying, you all do this all the time, and you have no problem saying that you can handle the future that way. But then you're going to deny to God that he can do the same thing, but of course he does it comprehensively. Now, as far as that second category I brought up, voluntary actions, those contingencies that are said to be contingencies, accidents, well, they want to say contingencies, because the freedom of the will. Many passages are brought forth narrating some act obviously voluntary, and yet God predicting the outcome. So you have something that's a voluntary act, and God's predicting the outcome. So you can't argue that this is a special circumstance. Well, that's in the Bible, and that's a special circumstance. Okay, but according to your argument, such foreknowledge and such voluntary action cannot ever coexist. And the moment you say, well, okay, there's a case in the Bible, okay, there's 10 cases, okay, there's 20 cases in the Bible, okay, the biggest thing's in the Bible. Acts 2:23, Acts 4:27 about the crucifixion of Jesus, and all the different actors were doing whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. So Pilate, Judas, the people, the crowds that released Barnabas, the Jews, the Romans, the people that plunged the stake into Christ's hands, everybody involved had their own motives, evil motives, and yet God predestined each of these motives to flow forth into each of these actions. And God foretold it beforehand. So there's not some obscure examples in Scripture. It's pretty much everything in Scripture, including the biggest things in the world. And so you can't say, well, that's just this case or this case or this case in the Bible, because according to your argument, they can't go together. So that falls apart. The mode of God's knowledge. And I'll wrap up here. And like I said, I'll do some application in the newsletter article. The mode of God's knowledge. How is this different from the first point on kinds? There's my picture. Hopefully you get an idea, but I'll explain each of them. These are just the modes in which God has this omniscience. First of all, by his own essence. We've already covered this in the last 3 weeks. Charnock made a big deal out of it, and I wanted to make a big deal out of it because I said this is going to knock down some pins, this is going to knock down some treasured idols. If God must know everything by himself. In other words, the way in which he knows them is to see them through the lens of himself. That's your answer to all of these objections, whether it's Molinism or whether it's aspects of Arminianism. Those things can't be, because if they were, all these other ways of God knowing couldn't be. So what are these other ways of knowing? Secondly, the second one is it has to be one intuitive act. So if you say, yeah, but for us, when I think about thinking, I have to think like this. Yes, you do, and so do I. God does not. He does not think in that inferential mode where he says, well, if I have to consider this, or he's at a crossroad, or he has to deliberate. He has to weigh the evidence and so forth. He doesn't actually know in that manner in himself. So when I say intuitive, the intuition is opposite of discursive reasoning. It's all at once, it's immediate, and so the lines there are covering the whole. He sees the whole. The analogy that you brought up, Mike, last week of this holding everything in his hand and apply to God's knowledge, that's exactly a perfect, it's a good starter analogy. Of course, like all other analogies, if the ball is in there or whatever it is, the crystal, God can see through it all. Of course, if I have a crystal in my hand, I still have to do this, and I can't see it perfectly, but it's a good starter, because the point is that God sees the whole in one view, right? Okay? It has to be independent. So I have to explain my X's here. The X is not denying independent knowledge, it's denying the opposite. The arrow is what's getting X'd here. What I'm signifying there is that he's not knowing because of. His knowledge is not dependent upon that which was there first. So you say, yeah, I know God's omniscient. He sees that thing. He discovers that thing. No. He never learns anything. He sees it all, just follows from the intuitive act. But it is also distinct. When we say that he sees all as one, in one act, we're speaking about the mode of the act. We're not denying that he also distinguishes between things. In his singular act, he also knows each distinct thing as a distinct thing. He doesn't confuse one thing with another. If I try to think of everything all at once, what happens? Total confusion, breakdown, right? Immediately. Because the first thing that happens is I lose the distinction between things. That's why I have to think like this. He sees all as one in an act and each as itself. That may not be obvious as far as why that matters, but it's a category we could certainly come back to. Infallibly, hopefully obvious. He never fails to know. So as he's piercing inward, for example, behind fig leaves, you can't stop that knowledge by hiding behind fig leaves over here. Or those in Revelation, if you want to go from the beginning of the Bible to the end, those that hide behind the rocks from the wrath of the Lamb. hiding. What are they? Same thing. His knowledge is infallibly seeing through anything. And then immutably, brought that up. So what the X there is denying, what we looked at that week, the plus and the minus, what's being denied there is any addition or subtraction of his knowledge. And again, if you're ever thinking, so then does he take into account, see, but again, when you do that, you're defining take into account as something that had to happen later. But he is not inside of time. He didn't have to get to your lifetime in order to know that thing perfectly. And then finally, perpetually, as in a pure act. And that is not just from beginning to end, but it's guaranteed to know in all the ages that can ever exist, including the eternal state. He knows all. And the whole point, it's supposed to explode your mind. But that explodes my mind. It's infinite. It's supposed to do that. You're supposed to get to that point where you're like, wow, I won't even scratch the surface of, and that's how you can know you're thinking of it right. You're looking at something infinite. It's worth reading out his next quote, and maybe I'll stop here, but this is how he describes that chart. God knows by his own essence. That is, he sees the nature of things in the ideas of his own mind and the events of things in the decrees of his own will. He knows them not by viewing the things, but by viewing himself. Pause there. He's not denying that he views the things. The word by is crucial there. He knows them not by. In other words, the viewing of the things did not cause the view. His view into himself, the ideas upon which he bases the pattern of those things, and his will to create those things, through viewing himself, he knows each thing. His own essence is the mirror and book wherein he beholds all things that he does ordain, dispose, and execute. And so he knows all things in their first and original cause, which is no other than his own essence willing and his own essence executing what he wills. So, to wrap that up, if God's knowledge of things outside of himself originated from something outside of himself, he could not know from eternity. Beyond that, Charnock says there could not be any images shot out from anything because there was not anything in being but God. That gets into a heady point, but I'll just read a couple more to close us out. Further, same subject, he says, the perfection of knowledge depends upon the excellency of the medium whereby we know. Stop. What he just said there was the perfection of any knowledge. If you're going to ascribe to God the perfect, the best, the most amount of knowledge, it has to be this way. If you land the opposite on any of these, it won't be. Why? It depends on the mode of it. You can't have perfect knowledge except by this medium or this mode. As a knowledge by reason is a more excellent way of knowing than knowledge by sense, so it is more excellent for God to know by his essence than by anything without him, anything mixed with him. The first would render him dependent, and the other would demolish his simplicity. I suppose we have a faint analogy of that when we need to get glasses, and we see by something that is alien to our perfection of sight because of some defect in our sight. I love the next point he makes, but it really gets to the deep end of the pool, and it gets into a subject that I like to talk about called realism. And the word he uses there is exemplar cause. Those are the Christian, I hate calling it the Christian version. It's the Christian correction, and it develops from Augustine to Aquinas, and then eventually the Reformed scholastics use this concept of as well. It's what Plato would have called forms. Modern philosophers call them universals, but think of when we use the words true or just or good or one, all these predicates we assign to things, they wouldn't make any sense unless there was a truth. You couldn't call things true or false unless there was a truth for them to be true about. You couldn't call something a just war and an unjust war, a just ruling and an unjust ruling, etc., unless there was something real called justice that is unchanging, immutable, immaterial, but infinite, never changes. And so Plato knew that. Augustine comes around and says, you knucklehead, you were onto it, but those are just the attributes of God or ideas in the mind of God. Exemplar causes, Charnock is using it the way Aquinas would have expressed that idea. An exemplar is a form or pattern or paradigm. So when the Bible says in Psalm 19:1 that the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies above proclaim his handiwork, etc., one of the things he's saying is that everything in creation was created to speak about God in particular ways. Mankind is the pinnacle, the zenith of that, the image of God. But everything is, in a sense, a lowercase image, in the sense that it is a reflection of God. It says something about God. Okay? Some things more specific than others. What Charnock's been laboring is to say that the reason why everything is the way it is because of something God knew about himself and desired to create a world that was constantly speaking about his glory, his perfections in different ways. And I don't want to get too deep. This is even true about evil things as they tend away from him. That will speak about him by lying about him. Okay, that's another story for another day. I will leave the application section for, like I said, my newsletter. Questions?